Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to our season finale of Insights with Professor David Lazer. Yes, we had a nice conversation about that, he made sure, and I told him, please do not hold it against me if I do mispronounce your name, but I did it. So we're happy about that. I'm sure as many of you all can agree on that this season has been terrific, and definitely we're looking forward to our spring season that will start in February. But I just wanted to let you know a little bit about David Lazer as he speaks to us on following the money networks in American politics. And definitely we can say with the recent midterm elections and the conversations about political contributions, this discussion is very timely. And Professor Lazer he's currently an associate professor in the Department of Political Science as well as the College of Computer and Information Science. He's also the director of the program on network governance at Harvard University. We were able to steal him, which is great. He has written and published several works, including DNA and the Criminal Justice System, the Technology of Justice, as well as Governance and Information Technology from Electronic Government and Information. In addition, he wrote an article on cell phone usage that recently appeared in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The article examined how patterns of cell phone use and proximity of one cell phone to the next can demonstrate levels of friendship among people. So very interesting. His latest work is based on the idea how people and organizations are connected together is critical to understanding the functioning and success and failure of active systems. He's also received a PhD from the University of Michigan. So at this time, I would like to welcome Professor Lazer.
Can everyone hear me okay? Super. My work revolves around trying to look at little clues and breadcrumbs of things and figuring out some meaning from them. So as Reja was mentioning, I've done this work looking at cell phone calls and figuring out if you can figure out who's friends with whom. I had a paper which actually has received some additional attention in recent months about how you can use DNA databases to connect crimes to relatives of the people in the databases. It's called familial searching. And right now, what I've become increasingly interested in is looking at the breadcrumbs that politics leave behind, the little digital clues, to see if we can figure out some of the patterns that are underlying, some of the processes underlying politics in this country. Now, what I'm going to show you today, I'll admit, is really just, it's work in progress, right? So there's some interesting patterns here. I'm not going to give you any conclusive stories, but it's going to be very different from sort of most stuff around politics that you've seen, or for that matter, even are done in political science, because these are the kinds of data that really had not been widely examined from a political scientific point of view. And like I said, what I'm going to talk to you about today is really sort of the beginnings of a research program. I think there's some interesting hints of things, and I'm going to just show you a few things, open it up for discussion. I'm not really, when I'm going to talk about, in terms of, for example, the money, I'm really not going to actually talk about the policies around campaign finance. But I'm going to take advantage of the fact that there are records on going back many decades on who gave money to whom, and see what we can pull out about how American politics has changed over the last few decades, and see what we can figure out about the underlying networks that mobilize money, which is oh so important to politics, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows. So I'm gonna talk about two data trails, if you will. And the first is based on Federal Election Commission data. So if you've ever given money to a federal candidate for office, you have to give your name and address and some employment information. That all goes into a database, right? So you can download that database that has all the information, you know, how much money you gave, on what date, to whom, what your address is, what your who your employer is. And you can even go to a website, fundrace.org. It's actually now on the Huffington Post. But you can put in someone's name and get their entire history of contributions and zoom in on the map, using Google Maps, and it will show their entire neighborhood with blue and red and purple dots and show the contributions that everyone gave. So if you go to fundrace.org, it's both cool and troubling at the same time. And there are some interesting questions. There are deep questions about transparency both in the good side and the bad side in terms of having all these data readily available. But of course, on the good side, you understand where politicians are getting their money from. So. So we have these data from the Federal Elections Commission. I'm going to show you some results from this. They're tricky data to work with, I should note, because every contribution is a discrete event. So, for example, the 2008 election might have involved hundreds of millions of discrete contributions of one citizen to a particular candidate. And if we look at over the decades, this is many billions of discrete events. So it's a little cumbersome to deal with. This doesn't just go into a neat Excel spreadsheet and work with. You can't work with standard SPSS programs. This is one of the reasons why political scientists have not looked at it, but this is also one of the reasons why I have a joint appointment in political science and computer science. So I'm going to look at those data, but then I'm also going to talk a little bit about data from campaign websites. So what we did this past October was scrape the front page of every single campaign website for House candidates, Senate candidates, and gubernatorial candidates. And we looked at the frequency of words, and so the question would be, for example, what are Democrats talking about, what are Republicans talking about on a day-by-day basis, and looking across every single campaign in the country. So I'm going to show you some, again, very preliminary results from looking at those data day by day through the month of October. So the first, actually I left a word out, it should be the flow of money over the last 20 years, not the of money, but I'm going to show you something called a dynamic cartogram. A cartogram is a distorted map, and you try to resize things based on information you're trying to convey. So in this map that I'm going to show you, and it's going to change, it's going to change over time because the amounts of money change over time, but every state is resized based on the amount of money that came from it. And so some states are very large, right, but very little money came from them. So a state like Montana, not a lot of money came from them. And then a state like New York, or actually if you go to the District of Columbia, obviously the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., is quite enormous in the money contributing business to politics. So I'm going to show you a distorted picture of the U.S. where states and the whole country grows and shrinks based on how much money there is. So you can look at the whole country and you get a sense of how much money was contributed to political campaigns on a month-to-month basis for 20 years. And the other dimension is that we color every state based on net money flow. So if it's orange, there's more money coming into the state, and if it's black or gray, there's money coming out of the state. And so you have states like, let's say, California, where there may be a big expensive campaign, and so there's a lot of money being contributed, but actually there's more money going into the state than coming out of it. So you can look at the colors of particular states. I should note that because of a little adapter problem, it's not quite as high resolution as I was hoping, but I'll do a little narration. So I'm going to flip here, and this should appear. And we have this is on the left side is the Democrats, on the right side are Republicans, and we start out pretty small. And you can see when you compare these cartograms, again, this starts in 1990, and so you can see California swells up, and you can see actually the money is coming from roughly the same places for Democrats and Republicans. But there are, if you stare at this long enough, and I've stared at it for a long time, you do see some states pop up more, like you unsurprisingly see the South is somewhat larger for Republicans, and well, Massachusetts is a little bit larger for Democrats. And you'll see as we watch this go, you'll see that it sort of pulsates, right? So it turns out that there's a real cycle to money giving, right? And there are cycles in multiple ways. So in election cycles, it turns out that candidates really want good quarterly reports. And so every quarter, when they have to report how much money they're getting, there's a big surge of contributions. So you see this big surge, and then it plummets, right? And then it starts building up, and there's a big surge, and it plummets again. And then, unsurprisingly, the amounts of money given go up and up as you get closer to an election. But furthermore, the other cycle you see, as you watch this, you're going to see. Obviously, there are certain states that are quite prominent. So New York is quite prominent. You'll see Washington, D.C. is quite prominent, and you will see that certain states just happen to emerge randomly at certain times, and that reflects the fact that there may be a big, expensive campaign, right? So there may be a campaign in Illinois, and a lot of money gets contributed to Illinois, and Illinois in that cycle will swell up, but then it won't be very large for 6 years, say, or 4 years. The other thing to note is that you'll see that the country gets progressively bigger. It goes in this cycle, but then as we get to recent years, you're going to see that the country gets extremely large, and of course you'll see that the geography of the country does not particularly reflect where the money is coming from. And you'll see, actually may have just seen, I can't quite make this out, but you'll see, for example, at one point, Massachusetts really swells up toward the very end, and that reflects the recent senatorial election. And unsurprisingly, Massachusetts was really protruded then because it was the only election, so lots of money was coming from Massachusetts for the senatorial race. I think that was it. There we go. So this, by the way, I have this. This is up on YouTube. So if you want to get a sense of it, you can play around with it. This gives a sense of the cycles of money. So you can see, first of all, and I should not. No, I didn't adjust this for inflation, but inflation is not the. This is not about inflation of sort of that kind of inflation you and I might think of. So this is the axis for money, and this is year, and you can see the money comes in waves. And unsurprisingly, these are 2-year cycles corresponding to 2-year election cycles. These are just federal races, so president, Senate, House races. But also you see, again, this little bumpiness, and that corresponds, first of all, you see the big bumpiness, and this corresponds, again, to the 2-year cycles. And then within there, you see quarterly cycles. And actually, we didn't do this on the daily level for this picture, but even within the week, there are certain cycles. There are certain days of the week where more money is given, and unsurprisingly, you don't see much money given on weekends, for example. So there's this real pattern to how much money is being given, but of course, you also see a shift in regime here. So you see a certain amount of money here, and then we see it sort of build up, and then starting in 04, it bumps up, and then 06, it bumps up again. And so we see this pretty pronounced upswing in the amount of money. And one of the interesting things with the recent Supreme Court decision will be actually a lot of the money will not actually be detected or reported in the FEC, so which has certain policy implications, but it's a sort of real bummer for social scientists like me trying to figure out what's going on. So, but there are also other deeper issues going on than upsetting me. The other interesting thing is looking at political polarization in this country. And we've all seen the red maps and the blue maps of the country. And it turns out, and this has been documented nicely, and this is a picture from a book by Bill Bishop, and this is a picture of it, that there has been, at the very local level, a polarization. Really has been a polarization of American politics if you look at the period from 1980 to the present. So here's a picture of the breakdown of competitive districts versus non-competitive districts, counties in the United States in 1976. 1976 presidential election, this is all based on presidential election data, was a very close election, right? Carter just barely beat out Ford in 1976. And you can see these white counties were all decided by, unfortunately you can't read this, by less than 20 percentage points. So these were reasonably competitive. We see much of the Deep South actually is still Democratic at this point, and very heavily so. And that reflects, there's been obviously a huge shift in American politics that's being captured here. But if you look at the rest of the country, we see there's a certain degree of non-competitiveness in the West, and that's tilted towards Republicans. In the South, it's tilted towards the Democrats. But most of the country is actually pretty competitive, that is within the 40-yard lines, if you will. Each candidate is getting 50-50 plus or minus 10 points. Well, let's flip to 2004, which was another very competitive election, right? Not quite as close, but quite close. And we see the South is actually shifted very much the other way, but we don't see the heavily Democratic areas as much. But most of the country now is no longer within the 40-yard lines. Most of the country, most of the counties are heavily Democratic or heavily Republican. So there has been, at the very local level, a real polarization in American politics in terms of how people vote in the presidential election. So one of the questions I had was, have we seen a similar polarization in a contribution? So if we think of, rather than votes at the county level, we think of money at the county level, and we say, how much of the money is within the 40-yard lines, right? How many counties are pretty competitive? The question is, how has that evolved over the last, well, in this case, we're just looking 20 years. And so what we did, and we haven't plotted the equivalent maps yet, but what we did was we plotted the standard deviation of the county breakdown of Democratic votes versus Republican votes for a 20-year period. The standard deviation is a statistical measure of the spread of a distribution. And so if one anticipates that spread, if there's greater polarization, then one would think that there would be this sort of smooth line upwards. If there's no change, you'd expect a pretty smooth line flat. And here, and so like I said, here's a picture. I'll show you the standard deviations in a moment. But here just takes 1 year of data, and this is broken down by the counties. Based on a visual inspection, one can see that, for example, again, money seems to be coming from the same places. The South is less Democratic, especially if you look in this part of the South right here. We see the Northeast, unsurprisingly, is a bit more Republican, but generally there seems to be a strong relationship between the two. And what we see when we look at the standard deviations at the county level is, well, there were two things. One thing is that there hasn't been, one looks at sort of an average over time, there really hasn't been a radical change, right? That in fact, there hasn't been a polarization at the county level. You don't have, in terms of money, counties generally haven't sort of split into all Republican or all Democratic counties. But the other thing, and I didn't anticipate this, is that the polarization of money at the county level, this is broken down month by month for 20 years, changes month by month. And there's this and I haven't figured this one out yet. But if one looks at the cycles, and this again is broken down, you look at every county is 60% Democratic money, 90% Democratic money, 50-50 Democrat versus Republican, and you see that polarization hits its low point in July of the election cycle. So like July 1990, July 1992, July 94, July 96, July 98. It hits the very bottom, but then it rapidly increases when come August, September, October, always reaching a peak in October. And so that means that there's this radical, within election cycles, again, I don't know the reason for this, there's a radical polarization of counties into Democratic and Republican counties in October of every election cycle. So somehow the election process is creating a sort of geographic polarization. I don't know why that would be, right? I don't know why why a Democratic county would become even more Democratic in October as compared to July. But it's hard to miss this pattern. The only thing I'd note is that the only exception, a little bit of an exception, is this last election cycle. Unfortunately, our data is only up to date through July. But we can see that it hit the low point in October 2009, and then it went up. And my guess is that that reflects the Senate election in Massachusetts, which received so much attention. It was a notably aberrant event to have a prominent election in January of an election year, right? So my guess is that the fact that the sort of money politics polarized early this year reflects something about Massachusetts, something happening here, sort of polarizing money. I don't really, again, I'll be interested if any of you have insights or clues about why this might be. The second thing one can do is look at connections between politicians as well as contributors based on contribution patterns. And I'm going to first talk about politicians. And so these are data from, I somehow lost the years in this, but these are, each of these triangles represents a candidate for the United States Senate. Okay, and we infer a linkage between two candidates for the United States Senate based on shared contributors. So if a lot of people give to John Smith and Jane Doe, then we say that there's a connection between the two. Somehow maybe one political organization helped mobilize money for another, but there's something going on there. And so what one can do then is see how the structure of those connections among Senate candidates has evolved over time. And so what one sees in 1994, for example, is that there are the street clusters. And so there's a very blue cluster, there's a very red cluster, but then there's a mixed cluster. And I think in part this reflects committee membership. So for example, if two senators may be from different parties, but they're on the same committee, and thus they get money from the same interest groups, right? And so that's what it looks like to me when one looks at this. And like I said, I wish I could pull out the names. Here, this is based on 2008 data. And so, for example, you could see. I'm trying to remember the data now. For example, there was a remarkably strong connection between Mitch McConnell, the minority leader for the Republicans, and Norm Coleman, who was running for re-election and lost narrowly to Al Franken. And so there's a remarkably strong connection between the two. And so that provides a hint that there's something going on there. That was the strongest connection in all the data, and it suggests that McConnell may have been mobilizing some of his money machine, if you will, for Coleman. Again, that would be a guess, but it provides a sense of the clues that might be hidden in the Federal Elections Commission data about hidden networks mobilizing money for candidates. And the other thing you can do is look at, and I'll explain these pictures in a moment, is make inferences about connections among contributors. So you can say, what's the connection among politicians, but then say, what's the connections among contributors, right? People go to campaign parties. People talk to each other about who to contribute to. And that might create certain signature patterns in the data. And so what we did was we looked at the data for a number of years. And we say, OK, you have person A and person B. And if they give repeatedly to the same candidates on the same day, so not just to the same candidates, but on the same actual precise day, that tells us something about a connection between those individuals. And so if we what if we drew, let's set a threshold of 4. So we observe at least 4 times 2 people gave money to the same candidates on the same day. And let's make a guess, and again, this is a guess right now, and again, this is very preliminary. that there's a connection between two people if they give money to the same candidate on the same day. And again, you could use different criteria here. What does that network look like for different cities? And so, for example, here's a picture of Boston, right? And we color the nodes based on whether they give predominantly to Democrats or to Republicans, and then you have a few there, a little purple that gave both to Democrats and Republicans. And you see, so this is the money network, if you will, of Republicans. And what this, again, what this line between this person and this person tells us is that there is, that they gave repeatedly to the same candidates, right? And so here's Boston. And we did this for a number of different cities to see, well, do you get different kinds of money networks, right? And so here's Boston, and here's Los Angeles. And Los Angeles is somewhat bigger, but not a lot bigger. Los Angeles is a significantly bigger city. Now, then you look at Washington, right? Washington has about the same population as Boston, at least Boston proper versus Washington, D.C. proper, and you see a bit of a difference in the networks. And then you look at New York City, which is like twice the size of Los Angeles in terms of its population, and wow, you know. So New York and Washington have very distinct patterns of networks, extremely much denser, with very clear, you know, Democratic regions and Republican regions in the network. Here's the sort of Republican Washington neighborhood. And you can, and here's some of the kinds of, one of the things we looked at was, let's look at the strongest ties and see whether we actually find some hint of a relationship among people. And so you can see, for example, Ryan Vincent and Carla Meyer. I don't know who any of these people are, but we could dig up records that they were on a board together, Washington, D.C., Ed Rogers and Lanny Griffith, partners in lobbying firm, and so on. And so the idea here, the interesting thing is, can we do things like predict, let's say we took candidate A and candidate B, and candidate A gets people at the very middle of the network. Does that help them mobilize more money later on? Because these are connectors. These are people who help mobilize the network. And so can we develop insights into how the network mobilizes money, and even make predictions on what will happen in the future based on who raises money from whom? So in any case, like I said, this is very preliminary, sort of tantalizing hints of things. And then I'm just finally, and then I'll come to a halt, and then we can sort of talk about these various things and sort of future directions. Following the words, right? So one of the amazing things that we can do in the internet age is that we can watch very easily every single campaign, what every single campaign is saying. I mean, think about what it would have taken 20 years ago to follow the rhetoric and the words of every single campaign, right? You would have had to have people watching every candidate, collecting literature from every campaign. Well, now, you know, I just have a postdoc set up this program that pulls down all the data and all the campaign websites from every single candidate for federal office on a daily basis, right? And then you can see, you know, what are they saying, right? And, you know, I'm going to show you very unsophisticated things here, but again, there are much more complex things you can do and that we're planning. And so what we did was we created a word picture here. And so this is the Democrat side on the left and Republicans on the right. And the words are sized based on how often the word was used by Democrats versus Republicans. These are just House candidates. So this is on the order of 800 candidates, so around 400 Democrats, 400 Republicans. And you can see certain words pop up. I mean, a lot of words pop up in both, so jobs pops up in both. I didn't talk fast enough, so let's see if I can. And this is day by day for the month of October. And as you can see, neither one of them is talking about Afghanistan or Iraq. Tax looms larger here on the Republican side. Democrats are not talking about Democrats, but Republicans mention the word Republican a lot. Which reflects, again, the nature of this political season where it was good to be a Republican and not so good to be a Democrat. And what we also did to get a sense of this was create in issue meter. Unfortunately, this is where the resolution is sort of not so good, but I'll point out what we did was we looked at the day-to-day frequencies of particular words being used by Democrats or Republicans. Again, red for Republicans, blue for Democrats. We see there are words like, this is jobs, tax, so jobs and taxes were being talked out a lot by both. But unsurprisingly, Republicans talk more about taxes than Democrats did. The last word is Obama, so you'll see that Republicans talk twice as much about Obama as Democrats. I suspect they may have been saying different things. We see social issues like the abortion and same-sex marriage, which are here, were not being talked about very much by either. Immigration was being talked about significantly more by Republicans. And so, nothing at this point was terribly shocking, but it does give you a sense of the different directions of the messages of Democrats and Republicans. And one of the things we're planning on doing is create a more extensive issuometer, if you will, based on official websites of members of Congress, starting with this new Congress, so that you can see who is highlighting what words and what words and what phrases, like look at Social Security versus national security, who's talking about Iraq and Afghanistan. How is that changing over time? As it turns out that in October, and this just reflects how the election unfolded in a short time, and it just reflects the fact that I didn't get to getting the data until October, there was the narrative of the campaign was really steady for the entire month, right? It wasn't like an issue suddenly came up on October 20th and everyone started talking about that. The agenda for the campaigns was really quite steady. But this could be just as if we think about again studying political communication as well as building tools about who is emphasizing what issues. There are really exciting possibilities here, and again, this is just really meant to be tantalizing, and I hope it's been interesting. But this is sort of represents sort of the beginning wedge of my own campaign into these data. So with that, I'll open up to questions. Thank you.